This is an interview with Ms. Dorothy Cotton of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. We're presently at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Today is April 22nd, 1999. Welcome to the Institute.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. What I'm doing today is trying to just get information about you and, of course, how, in fact, you got involved in the struggle. But before the struggle, there was a lot of Dorothy Cotton that prepared you for that.
Yes.
So I'd just like to know, where were you born in Alabama?
No, I was born in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And Goldsboro is on the eastern side of the state. Most people would certainly know Raleigh, the capital of the state, even if they never heard of Goldsboro. But Goldsboro is about 52 miles or so south of Raleigh on the eastern side of the state. Goldsboro, North Carolina. I won't tell you what year.
Okay, I won't ask.
Right. But it was a long time ago. Actually, I was a Depression baby.
Okay. What about siblings?
Yes, there were 4 of us. My parents produced 4 girls, and my mother died when I was 3 years old, and she died leaving these 4 toddlers, actually. And again, I was 3, and I was the second born. So the firstborn, Effie May, our last name Foreman, Effie May, and Dorothy, myself, and the third sister, Daiselle, and Margaret, who was not even a year old when my mother died. And that's a very sad story for me because my mother died in childbirth, and her youngest, Margaret, my youngest sister Margaret, was not even a year old. So I hope I'm not going to cry, but I really get very emotional even now when I think about, you know, those times and how hard it must have been with, my mother obviously, producing babies just much too fast. Because we were all of us were literally born 1 year apart, which meant that she had conceived again after 3, and when her baby was 3 months. We were literally born 1 year apart from each other. So you can do the math there. 3 months after each baby, she had conceived again. And I guess they didn't know about birth control in those days, but she died in childbirth and would have been the 5th child.
What was the educational level of your mother and father?
I really don't know. I think my mother, it's interesting, I've never asked anyone. I think my mother finished high school, but I'm really not sure of that. But I know that my father did not. My father, actually Daddy said he went to school one day and didn't like it and never went back. My father grew up in a very rural area of North Carolina in Greene County. And that's a little bit vague, and they were living on a farm and in a very isolated area. There were not even other houses around. I did get that much in an interview with my dad's oldest living sister. She also died last year, but I'm really glad that I got her on tape describing something of that childhood. But it was in a very rural area in Greene County, living on a farm, and they didn't, schooling was not important. What was important, as was true quite broadly across the South, was that you work on the farm. Work on the farm.
That's why children were born, to work.
Yeah, that's right. And the more the merrier, right?
Did you continue to live with your father after your mother died?
When, though my mother had, lots of sisters, and my dad said the various sisters offered to take, one of us, and we would have been scattered all about. And though I sort of assessed my childhood as being rather painful childhood, and my dad, not even the kindest father in the world, but I guess he did care in his own way, because he said to them, no, I want to keep these young'uns together. And he did keep us together, a struggle though it was, but he kept us together. He would not allow various aunts to take us and have us scattered all about. So we grew up together.
What kind of work did he do?
My father worked in the tobacco factory, and that tobacco factory there in Goldsboro, North Carolina, was not far down the road from where we lived at 917 North Greenleaf Street. A little three-room shack of a house with an outhouse in the backyard.
Right.
But I was born in that little house. They just tore those there were three of them. I took a photograph because I wanted to use the photograph of that little house in a book that I'm doing on this same history and my story.
What do you remember about your elementary school days?
Oh dear, that's, I think my childhood was not a happy childhood. So the elementary school days, really a kind of a blank, but I know that it was Greenleaf School, and I lived on Greenleaf Street. I don't think that building even exists anymore. I'm not really sure about that, but it was, the elementary school was Greenleaf. That's interesting. No one has asked me about my elementary school days, but I have lots of memories about my high school days for a very particular reason.
Right.
But I have the elementary school days. It's really kind of a blank. I know that it was very difficult. You know, I think of things in relationship to my younger years, the elementary school days. You know, things like having to leave school one day to go get my tonsils taken out, which they did in the doctor's office. And no one went with me to do that. There was no, you know, I had no mother to go with me. My father had to be at this factory. And, you know, that's all so painful for me that I went to have this done. And then I remember when my dad came home, I was already there in bed. And I remember the nurse in the doctor's office, after taking out my tonsils, saying, somebody should be with you here. And of course, many, many years after the fact, I hope I don't cry, but many years after the fact, I think certainly someone would have been with me if...
You mean, wait a minute, you walked from school
to get my tonsils
to get your tonsils
That's
taken
right,
out.
and I walked home.
Afterwards,
I came
you
home.
walked home.
That's it.
And you were
And no adult went with me. They did it right in the doctor's office. Oh, I think I'm gonna cry.
Don't cry.
And when go ahead.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I was simply going to ask the question, how did you get back and forth to school?
Walking, of course.
You were...
So the Greenleaf School, I think, was not, and I lived on Greenleaf Street, so I think it was, I'm gonna go right back to Goldsboro and go see, I think that building doesn't exist anymore.
Now, was your high school in that vicinity, in the same area?
Dillard High School, of course, we all walked to school, but it was further away. That building does still exist. They use it for some other purposes now.
Right.
But walking to school was the order of the day.
Right.
There were no school buses for us.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, high school, what about extracurricular activities? Did you participate?
Oh, yes. High school days are so much clearer and happier because of a teacher. And I love to, as you know, I do a lot of public speaking now, and on occasion I have the opportunity to talk with teachers, and I'm so just ready to motivate, to encourage, and to affirm that what they're doing and helping to, you know, call for the best in these youngsters that they're working with and helping to mold them, because of a teacher that I had, Miss Rosa Gray, in high school, my English teacher. Because I think Miss Rosa Gray took such an interest in me. And I think I shudder to think what would have happened if she had not taken an interest in me, because it was like she really just took me under her wings. Now, being the English teacher, she also was the drama teacher. And I think perhaps most high schools, at least what we did anyway, had an annual high school play. And I did so well in her English classes, and I used to love to memorize poetry, and she'd have us recite poetry in the classes. And I remember that she said to me when some students were, you're sort of stumbling through the poetry, and I said my poem with such a flair, and afterwards she said, "There's your ready girl," and so she was constantly affirming me, and I know that I loved doing that. I loved the poetry, and I loved English, and I'm sure that's why I majored in English once I got to college. But I'm fast forwarding that. How did I get to college? But to have the leading role in the high school plays was very important, and I think really put me on a track of affirming that I had something to bring to the environment, and I was very good in the plays thanks to Miss Rose Gray. But she really took an interest in me, and of course I wanted to really please her,
Right.
and so we were very close.
That's obviously part of your support network.
Yes.
Did you have others, your family members in that general area that was part of your network as well? The support network, you mentioned aunts and maybe uncles. Was that a part of your upbringing?
No, my childhood was very difficult and very painful, and a part of what made it painful was that I didn't feel a support network, and a part of the reason for that, for example, these several sisters, my mother's sisters, they didn't live in close proximity to us, but not very far away. But they didn't interact with us in a really close way.
Did they have children your age?
Yes, they had children, but we didn't live in the same neighborhood, but we didn't live far away. But a part of the problem, I think now, at this age, I think I can analyze it this way, and I think this is accurate. I think that my father was sort of persona non grata with first of all, my grandfather, my mother's father, because my father, and these are his words, he stole my mother, and that's the word he used. So they ran off and got married, and Grandpa never didn't approve of the marriage. Now, I don't know, and Grandpa also had 3 sets of children, so he had 3 different marriages. He was kind of an itinerant preacher, but he would come around sometimes, and when Grandpa would come around, I know there was always a scowl on my dad's face, so they were not close. I don't know if that's the reason that, therefore, my mother's siblings weren't around, but I asked my dad's sister some questions about my mother since I didn't know her, and something of the relationship, and she said, well, Claude, that's my dad's name, didn't want her around so much. I think my dad was, I think he sort of kept people at arm's length in a real way.
So that sort of isolated
I think so.
the girls.
I think so. I think so. At the same time, I do remember my dad's, this is my dad's oldest sister and her children coming around more than some of the others.
Growing up in a southern town, small town, what was that like for young girls your age? In Birmingham, where I grew up, we often talk about how separate and unequal all facilities were.
Yes.
Did you experience the same kind of situation in Goldsboro?
Oh yes, there was, as I describe and refer to often, we really had apartheid in this country. We really had rigid separation of the races, and one incident that I focus on a good bit is the way, for example, the pavement, you could tell where the black folk lived, because when it got, even though whites lived in close proximity to black folks, the pavement would stop when it would get to the section where black folk lived. And I remember a white boy riding his bicycle down Greenleaf Street, and as he was riding, he was singing, and riding down and stirring up dust on his bicycle. I remember the dust even, but he was singing "Deep in the Heart of Nigger Town," And I remember being very upset about that. Again, I'm just writing about this,
Sure.
and I remember that was very painful for me. And I remember even, I think I was about 10, when I heard him doing that. And of course, I felt really helpless to do anything, but I remember I reacted to that. I remember that I was hurt and angry. So yes, the segregation was really complete. And I think that my dad, given his lack of exposure to anything outside of that world where he was struggling to make a living, to feed his 4 girls, he had no exposure to anything except the really hard life of working in this factory. But I do remember his oldest sister's children. And they only lived part of the time just 2 or 3 streets over. And Dad used to, when things were a little bit better, he would buy watermelons and sell them from the front yard. When he had more than, he said sometimes he made $9 a week at the tobacco factory. And of course, in those days, everything was cheaper. You got a great big watermelon for a quarter. And when Dad was feeling a little bit fluent, I guess, and had more than the $9, a little bit left over, he would buy a whole load of watermelons from somebody who came by selling, and the Dad would sell them, for 10 cents more.
Yes.
And I remember, and on Sunday it was a big celebration because he, cut 2 or 3 of them. And I remember his oldest sister's kids running across when they saw, we've got watermelons in the yard, and they would run across and of course share in the festive eating of watermelons.
Right. In any kind of apartheid system, whether it's in America and South Africa, there were always brutal kinds of events that would take place. I've had people tell me about the way that they or someone close to them may have been accosted by a police officer, or something that may even lead to something even more brutal, maybe even a murder or lynching. Was that ever evident in your childhood that you knew of personally that may have happened to someone that was close to you?
I'm not aware of physical violence from whites or policemen in the area where we live. I'm aware of the dysfunction of the folk who lived in the neighborhood, and people fighting, but I'm talking about, sort of intra-group. As a matter of fact, there, but no violence, interracial or coming from the police.
Yes.
Because we didn't, my dad would just go to the tobacco factory. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't do anything. It was just that hard life of just eking out a living. And so he wasn't interacting.
And you were basically totally isolated.
That's my sense of it.
From the white community.
Absolutely.
Now, as you approached your senior year in high school, you must have been thinking about, well, what do I do next?
I wish I could be clearer on how I knew that I wanted more education, that I wanted to go to college, since I was not around people who were college trained. But so it must have come from my teachers, especially Miss Rosa Gray, my high school teacher. And I remember meeting Mary McLeod Bethune. Dr. Bethune spoke at my school. As a matter of fact,
At your high school?
actually, when she spoke, I'm sort of ahead of the story here, but I had already made my way over to Shaw University, and I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. But I heard her say, and I had just gotten over there from my school, but well, let me tell you about how I got there. It must have been Miss Rosa Gray taking an interest in me and also encouraging me to go forward, because I remember once she came to my house to talk to my father, because Daddy would not let me go to the junior senior prom. Well, see, Daddy, I know this now, many years after the fact, that he probably didn't know what a prom was, but also that he probably didn't have any money to dress me up to go to the prom. But when I told Miss Gray that Dad said I couldn't go to the prom, she came to my house and she sat on the porch of this little 3-room shack of a house and pleading with my dad to let me go and that she would take care of me. And he said, I just isn't ready for my girls to go to dances. You know, that he was gonna talk fancy for the teacher.
Right, that's right.
But Dad, he probably, didn't know what they were, but I'm sure,
So did you get to go to the?
so no, I didn't go. But I really think it's because he couldn't dress me up, he couldn't buy me a dress. But I knew, again, specific to your question, the seed was planted somewhere in high school, and I think with my interaction with the teachers, that I too wanted to either be a teacher or to do some things that they had done. So the teachers were the influence in my life in terms of my developing a vision for doing something with my life other than, well, what I saw around me.
What about your sister? You had an older sister, right?
Yes, I'm the only one of the 4 that went to college. All 4 of us finished high school, and my 3 sisters got married shortly after high school, and started having raising their families. And I'm the only one that went to college. Another thing that happened when I was in high school was I worked for white families. I would go sometimes before school to help a white woman who ran a boarding house. And she used to feed teachers. Teachers lived there, and I'd help with the breakfast, and then I'd run off to school. And I'd go after school to help with the dinner and the dishes and all of that. And I worked for 2 families. I ended up working for 3 white families. And I noticed that their homes were so much nicer than our homes. You asked about the influence. What I know is that I was thinking, these people live better than we do. And why do they live better than we do? I think, I don't know for sure, but I think that must have had some influence. I'd like a house too that has, nice shiny floors rather than floors where you get a splinter in your foot if you walk without shoes, or that's carpeted, or really nice home and nice dishes and all.
Your world had been broadened
That's right.
by these experiences.
That's right.
Of being around people who had more than you.
That's right. But interestingly, I don't know if I should say this on tape or not, but maybe I will. My sister also worked for Mrs. Broaders, who had the boarding house for the teachers. But let me not put it so much on her because, but I think some of us can see or be in an environment, and one thing happens to some of us, and a different thing happens to others of us. Like my sister would say, oh, I love working with the public. We were sitting in a restaurant, and she meant she'd love to be a waitress. And I'm saying, I don't want to be a waitress, I want to own the restaurant. So I don't know where that comes from, just a whole different reaction to what we see and what we experience. But I knew that I wanted to do something different with my life than what I was seeing around me, and it probably was that exposure. First of all, the teachers taking a real interest in me, and then just the exposure to the way other families lived and had more.
Did you ever get to go to your teacher, the teacher that you referred to?
Miss Gray?
Yeah, did you ever get to go to her home?
I never went to Miss Gray's home, and incidentally, she was, in those days, they would say the old maid teacher or spinster teacher. She was indeed Miss Gray, not married, but so devoted to her teaching. I remember long after high school, I was visiting in Goldsboro, and she knew I was in town and invited me and 2 or 3 other students, a fellow named William Harrison, who also had the male leading role in those plays every year. I just saw him like 40 years after the fact or more in Washington, yes, and he went on to make movies, and they didn't know that I probably should have gone to drama school, but nobody knew to send me to drama school because but William Harrison, who I just reconnected with he lives in Falls Church, Virginia, but he made some movies, and we just reconnected just a couple of months ago, and remembered and reflected on Miss Gray, how she took an interest in both of us. But yes, seeing that life could be different, being exposed to something other than the neighborhood that I lived in, and seeing a lot of dysfunction in the neighborhood. Men would fight. I think 2 or 3 houses down the road, somebody sold whiskey by the glass, and there was a lot of traffic in and out of that house. That's right. Is that what they call it? Shot house. Yeah. And then a couple of men in the 2 or 3 houses there would fight over something, and I remember at least one fight that they got into. So there was a good bit of, well, that kind of dysfunction, maybe not a lot, but there was some. But I just knew that life could be different.
Why Shaw University?
Miss Rosa Gray, again, started talking to me about college and she made the call over there to make arrangements for me to go. In other words, to get me a job. And to this day, I don't know how my dad let me go. He wouldn't let me go to the prom because he wasn't ready for his girls to go to dances. But Miss Gray called over there and got me, went through all the machinations of registration and she arranged 2 jobs for me. I worked so I ended up putting my things in a cardboard box and got a fellow that seemed interested in me Henry Bowden, to drive me, my first boyfriend, I think, to drive me to Raleigh with my things in this box. But Miss Gray had phoned over. She had made the arrangements. I never got a penny from anyone. Not a family member ever gave me a coin. I worked in the dining hall, and I cleaned the teacher's dormitory. Eventually, I started working in the president's home. This is an interesting story. I walked in the president's home when that job was arranged for me, went into the basement of the president's home, and there was an African woman, a student there, ironing sheets on one of those big presses that they have in because you ironed all the linens, even hand towels and that sort of thing. The president's home was, they entertained a lot. But there was this African student. I'll fast forward over some history, but that African girl that I met when I went to also help in the president's home, her name is Angie Brooks. Angie Brooks was from Liberia. Angie Brooks became the Attorney General of Liberia. And I met her ironing sheets, and I was in Liberia once and met her there. So I thought that's an interesting story that she too. So when I hear, as you know, I was Director of Student Activities at Cornell University for almost 10 years, and students used to have big protests because they weren't getting enough student aid, and I thought, oh my goodness,
So what's that?
what's that? And they weren't getting enough student aid. I got no student aid. I got no family aid. I had 3 jobs working my way: the teacher's dormitory, the dining hall, working at the president's home. I killed myself, I think. It was too much. I don't recommend that much working to work through school, but that's how I got there. But thanks to Miss Gray, who set that all up for me.
What was the transition like coming from Goldsboro to Raleigh?
Well, that was easy enough. I remember no particular hardship around that because everybody at Shaw was poor, as I recall.
Right.
All the students were poor. All the students were working. I lived in Esty Hall. That was, I guess, the freshman dormitory at Shaw. A little back up. I guess it is a Baptist college there in Raleigh, North Carolina. But everybody was kind of in the same boat. I remember living in the dormitory. My roommate there and I remember I had one dress-up dress, and my roommate and I would exchange. And I remember I had yellow, green, yellow, and black stripes going around. But sometimes when I needed to dress up, I'd borrow her dress-up dress, and sometimes just to have a change.
Yeah.
And she borrowed mine, and we would exchange. I can't imagine with the way as finicky as I am now about things. Again, I didn't even have a suitcase. I had my things in a little cardboard box, and it held everything I owned. And but it was okay because we were all just in the same boat, as I said.
Is there any highlight at Shaw? I remember when my wife went off to school, she said she just enjoyed being at Tuskegee. She's from Birmingham. She just enjoyed being at Tuskegee so much that she didn't want to come home during the breaks because at least she considered herself grown when she was there. She didn't have to go by her father's rules.
Yes.
Did you have Any feeling such as that?
That's very interesting. I'm sure that was true for me. And I'm not sure I felt totally grown till I can talk about that, some things that happened subsequent to this. But to be away from, Greeley Street at last and on my own. But I do remember the hardship of working so much.
Did that negatively impact upon your studies?
Yeah, I think, yes, I remember it, just really very hard. Even so, I enjoyed my studying. But I just think I was too tired, but I still did it, and I was a pretty good student. And I didn't take a full load. It took me, an extra year to finish college because I couldn't take a full load. But yes, I felt, like I was on the road to, I knew something was on the horizon for me, something other than what the environment that I had come from. Something better was on the horizon, and I know that I took hope from that,
you were
that vision.
anticipating.
That's right, I was anticipating what was waiting for me down the road, and I was just willing to, as an old song we used to sing in the churches, something about run on and see what the end's going to be. So I remember feeling that sense of hope that things are going to get better. And some very interesting things happened, like after the first year at Shaw University, ironing those sheets in the basement and taking care of this house, when Dr. Robert Prentice Daniel, the president of Shaw University at the time, got offered the presidency of Virginia State College in Petersburg, Virginia. That's how I got to Virginia. I polished those floors so well in the president's home. I ironed those sheets, so I took such good care of that house. When he took the job at Virginia State College, it's now Virginia State University, but they took me with them. I transferred from Shaw University after about a year and became a student at Virginia State College in Petersburg, Virginia. And at this point, I now lived in the president's home, no longer in the dormitory. And there was a space on the third floor. It's kind of like a loft, part of it.
Yes.
There's another girl who lived there too.
How was Shaw different from Virginia State?
Virginia State College, it seems to me, was a much more affluent situation. As I look back on it, I remember Shaw University at the time as indeed being kind of a poor, struggling school. But I only know that after, I wasn't conscious of that then. Right. But when I got to Virginia State College, my sense was, again, it's a state school. Shaw is a church-related school, and so the state school had a little bit more money. Yes. I mean, in no way, again, this is the period of our apartheid in this country. Right. And so Virginia, the University of Virginia, at the time, black folk couldn't even go there. Sure. And so they built as most people, I guess, would know. They
separate but equal.
Separate but unequal. Separate and very, very unequal. Right. But it was, it had more facilities, better buildings and everything than did Shaw University, because obviously there was a little bit more money at Virginia State.
So were you a junior at that time when you went to?
Oh no, I was not a junior. I think I had just barely finished the first year of college. Yes.
Okay. Is there anything that stands out in your mind about your experiences at Virginia State?
Oh yes. Virginia State College. I became very active in the Student Christian Association. I was always in extracurricular activities, so as hard as I worked, I found some extracurricular things to do. And every Sunday evening, I was holding forth at the evening meeting. It was sort of, the YWCA sort of gathering on the campus, but it was called the SCA at the time, Student Christian Association. And every evening, I'm there and I'm leading the singing and we're having discussions. And Dr. Sam Gandy, Dr. Gandy, we called him Reverend Sam Gandy at that time, was the minister there at Virginia State College. And he too took an interest in me and seemed to have been encouraging me. to take a leadership role. And another program that I'm not sure whether I started it or not, but there was a program called the Evensong. And as I said, I always liked poetry. And another program that I did all by myself with the college organist was to do a program called the Evensong, and that you would the students would come in on Sunday evening and would just hear this voice coming over the microphone reading poetry. And the organist would play, and it was, there were themes. If it's Thanksgiving, I'm reading about, the earth and plenty and whatever. But planning those poetry readings. And so I was very active. And apparently I needed to do, the extracurricular things because work was hard. Though I lived in the president's home, that was not as grand as it sounded. The house was quite grand compared to anything that I had ever seen. And I remember my dad came to visit once, and he said, he looked at the floor so shiny, and he said, "What in the world does anybody want to have that floor shining like this for?" Dad had never seen floors that were all polished and shiny. I made them shine. But it was hard. The president's wife, Mrs. Daniel Blanche Taylor Daniel, she would ask me, I remember when she asked me to take down the curtains and wash them the night before examination the next day. So it wasn't though. And sometimes they wanted to think of me as a daughter. They had no children, Dr. and Mrs. Daniel. And so I was sort of part daughter and part maid. Yes. So it was hard.
Whatever happened to the librarian young woman that you had met?
At Shaw University, well, of course, she went on to graduate from Shaw University, but I left, I think she graduated the year I left Shaw and went on. She was not taken to Virginia by the Daniels. Right. And, but it was I never forgot her, many years later, when I am visiting in Africa, in Liberia. I had followed her career though, and I knew that Angie had become the Attorney General in Liberia. Right. And another woman, Mabel Fagan, another Liberian student. We had just a wonderful visit there. This was before the awful coup some years ago. And
at Black institutions, many times Africans would come and go to certain institutions. Chain State, Lincoln. Yes. Was that the case at Virginia State? And if so, were there any relationships that developed between the African American students and the African students?
At Shaw University, yes. I'm not aware of an African presence at Virginia, at the State College, once I got to Virginia. But at Shaw University, I think there was a definite, and intentional outreach to African students. And, it was church related, and I think that was an interest of the churches to bring African students for their education. Right. But Angie went on to, I'm not sure where she went to law school and got her advanced degrees, but I think she did that also here, I think in New York. Yes. But, and I knew that she had gone back to Liberia at some point when I had the opportunity to visit.
What did you do after Virginia State?
Well, I got a job working in the library and at Virginia State College. Having lived in the president's home, I'm still living in the president's home. And when I graduated and worked in the library, and I became very active in a church downtown in Petersburg, Virginia. And that church was the Gillfield Baptist Church. And they had this handsome young preacher named Wyatt T. Walker. Reverend Walker became the pastor of Gillfield Baptist Church. And now, I graduated and got married in the president's home. Oh, that's another story. I did get married in the president's home. That's when I really moved out. But in the interim, I had
this job. Is this someone that you met while at
As a matter of fact, the entire time that I was at Virginia State College, I was being courted by this older guy who would, I felt like he would drive, he had this big Buick car, and it was like he would drive onto the campus and take me away from my struggles and my troubles, and we'd go somewhere and, you know, celebrate and have a glass of beer or something. Very naughty, glass of beer. That was
That particular time, that was.
that's right. Go somewhere and listen to jazz and drink beer. Which I don't even like very much, but it felt I was, you know, a little more grown up now. But
Independent.
I ended up marrying a George Cotton after almost 6 or 7 years of courting, but it became sort of a habit just to hang out with George during my later college years, and eventually working in the library, then getting married as I'm still living in the President's home, but also getting active in this church, Gilfield Baptist Church. Reverend Walker, interesting comment I'll never forget about him. I'm not sure I should be telling all of this because it's going to be in my book, but that will help the book along.
Yes, it'll be here, and you can always say, well, you know, if you want to hear this story, go to the Institute and read it here.
Right. But Reverend Walker was not the pastor initially when I went to, apparently when I went to Petersburg, Virginia, because when he did come as pastor, he was pastor when I became active in the church, but he said, he used to tell this event, he was wearing, in those days they called them Bermuda shorts, I don't know if they still do, but the Reverend Walker showed up on his way to go play golf in his Bermuda shorts, and a little old lady at the church said, "You are a new pastor, you are a new young pastor. Well, son, you ain't lived long enough to have sinned long enough, to have repented long enough, to be telling me what to do." So that was her response to seeing such a young guy.
His introduction.
His introduction to one of the members of the church.
Yes.
You ain't lived long enough to have sinned long enough, to have repented long enough to be telling me what to do. But anyway, I got to know the Reverend Walker, and very active in the church. We, black folk, could not use the public library in Petersburg, Virginia. Reverend Walker became head of the local chapter of the NAACP, and always smarted under the fact of, you know, the whole segregation, but targeted at some point that library that wouldn't allow black folk to come to the public library, if you can believe that. But he wanted the NAACP headquarters to take that case and to take it, fight it in the courts, our exclusion. They had so many cases on the docket at the time, they wouldn't take the case. They just had too many. And Reverend Walker said, "We're going to do this anyway." So we started our own protest, and I ended up at the church making picket signs and helping younger people, younger than I, make picket signs so that we could walk in front of the library protesting. I need to get the year of this. This must have been around 1950.
Before Brown?
No, it was after
Brown.
After Brown. So things were sort of moving. As a matter of fact, Reverend Walker knew Martin Luther King. I'm not sure where he met him, but he knew him. But we began mounting a campaign against the segregated library. Also, I remember walking in front of the Woolworth store downtown, and all of this activity emanating from Reverend Walker's church, Gilfield Baptist Church. And I was very key in helping to talk about nonviolence with the young people, and they were all younger people who were interested in helping with the protests in Petersburg, in front of the library, and of course we now must have been very close to, I think maybe this might have been 1959. The reason is I went off to graduate school in between, and I finished my master's degree in 1960.
Where did you go?
Boston University. But I would go up, and I'm now married. I would go up in the summer, and then I went up the following summer, and then I'd go up. And then once I told my husband, I'm just going to go in and stay and finish. And I remember that I finished the degree in August of 1960. And I'm a little bit ahead of the story here, but in 1960 is also when I moved to Atlanta. But to back up again, Reverend Walker invited Martin Luther King to come to Petersburg, Virginia, to speak at one of our mass meetings. So now, this might even have been early 1960. I have to do a little research and really pin this down, because the sit-in movement had started, and which was in 1960.
60, right.
And the Montgomery bus boycott had happened, but that was 55. And so sometimes between 55, we now knew Martin Luther King had given this wonderful leadership in Montgomery, Alabama. And just watching how the leadership that he gave there, Reverend Walker knew that, he'd be, just a good speaker for one of our mass meetings.
Had he developed SCLC at that point? Had SCLC developed?
No, I think SCLC was just an idea at this time.
Because
But-
that would have been in 57, when SCLC was.
Well, the first
organized.
meeting,
Right.
when it was first organized. What Martin Luther King did, and when he came up to speak, I was on the program that night. I think I did some poetry again, but somehow, we always don't just have a speaker come in and speak. You
Right.
have some music and some other things. We used to try to get students at Cornell to understand this. You don't just invite a speaker and give them a bunch of money and have something else on the program, make it more interesting.
That's right.
So I was also on the program, and we had dinner at the parsonage afterwards. As a matter of fact, I found a photograph just recently of meeting Dr. King. The very first time I met him, the Young Women's Parish Club at the church, we took a picture with him, but we had this dinner at the pastor's house. And on that visit, Reverend Dr. King invited Wyatt T. Walker to come to Atlanta to help him develop this organization, SCLC. And Reverend Walker said, I will come if I can bring the two people who helped me most here with our local movement in Petersburg, Virginia, and that was a fellow named Jim Wood and me. And I said to my husband, I think I'll go down and help them out. Reverend Walker has invited me to go down and Dr. King to be his administrative assistant till they get going. And my husband drove me down to Atlanta, and he was coming back and forth to visit. And I said I was going to stay about 6 months, but I stayed 23 years.
23 years.
And the movement then became my whole life.
Yes. Now, that's very interesting, because now what you've done, you embarked upon really giving your life to the movement. What are some of the first issues that you encountered once you arrived at Atlanta?
Well, I did work in the office as administrative, assistant to Wyatt Walker, who now, is the executive director. And so in these kinds of offices and this kind of work, you do a lot of things. I only had typing in high school and a little, of course, shorthand, but so I think, and again, I wasn't really a secretarial type, but I was, I think, a good administrative type person, just helping sort of oversee and keep things moving and helping Reverend Walker in that way. But shortly after I was there, the Highlander Folk School, which was at Montego, Tennessee, shortly after I was in Atlanta, the Highlander Folk School, oh dear, there's so much about it in this story. I'd have to say just a little bit about Highlander and how we got a program that Andrew Young and I came to actually direct. But I remember Dr. King came and sat in front of my desk once in our little office. When Wyatt and I got there, there were, I think Ella Baker was still there, but she didn't stay long after these bunch of preachers, these chauvinistic preachers got there. And so she was not around the office very much. And there were maybe a couple of other people, Lily Hunter and...
Did you get to know Ella Baker?
I was in I remember, going out to eat together a few times, and I knew her some, not in any great detail. She wasn't around long after all the preachers moved in. And Dr. King was just actually moving into Atlanta too, from Montgomery shortly before that. We sort of moved in, even though SCLC, they had the organizational meeting in 57, was it?
Right.
And but in terms of really becoming the organization that we know about now, that took some time for it to evolve. We started out in this little office, And I think it might have had maybe 2 rooms rather than as opposed to big floor of offices. But when Dr. King pulled up his chair, it was like he was just getting to know me. And I'm new in town. I'm going to be a part of his staff now, and I think one of the reasons he was talking to me was just to see kind of where my head was at, and if I had any sense, if you will, or what my skills might have been, because they were in discussion about receiving a program called the Citizenship Education Program. Fast forward a minute here, that program became my responsibility. Andrew Young was very key in our getting that program. Highlander Folk School was in the courts fighting for its very life. Miles Horton at Highlander, a white guy.
That's in Tennessee.
In Montego, Tennessee. They were fighting for their very lives because the state of Tennessee was trying to take that property and ultimately did. And they had a program called the Citizenship Education Program. Septima Poinsett Clark of Charleston, South Carolina, was working at Highlander, and Septima was, and British Robinson, who actually was the first citizenship school teacher after Septima got there. They were the staff at Highlander. But the Marshall Field Foundation that was funding that program they knew about the court situation. And the reason the state was taking that property really was because Miles Horton, a white guy, in rural Tennessee, is bringing black folk and white folk together up there in this folk school to discuss their problems and to discover their own capacity to solve their problems. And he used to get beat up and that sort of thing, but they accused them of just all manner of evil, selling whiskey and but they took they ultimately
a communist as well.
Yeah, that's right. That communist school they called it. One woman said they wouldn't have known communism from rheumatism. They called it a lot of communism going on up there.
Mm-hmm.
But the state won, and the property was confiscated. As Septima said, they even took cans of peas from the shelf. Highlander is a beautiful piece of property. But of course, Miles, they found other property, and Highlander is now, going strong. But that program, during that time of the impending transition, the Marshall Field Foundation knew that they didn't want to give the grant for running this training program, citizenship education, to that school because they probably saw the handwriting on the wall that they were going to lose it. So SCLC got this training program. We inherited that training program, and Andrew Young came down to administer the program because they selected the Congregational Church headquarters, United Church of Christ it is now, in New York, and Andy was living in New York. And so Andy came down. Actually, Andy was going to come and work at Highlander, but all this impending transition was about to happen. Right. And we got the program, so Andy ended up coming over with the program from Highlander to work at SCLC to administer this program. Right. And that program became my full-time responsibility as well, and rather than being administrator with Wyatt in the office there. So we then started to develop and further develop and expand this adult training program that was started at Highlander Folk School, teaching black adults how to read and write, and so they could register and vote. It was not just literacy for literacy's sake, but that's what the program was about, really to help the black folk around those islands of Charleston, South Carolina, just discover, a different sense of themselves.
Would that have any relationship with the voter education project that we eventually?
No, we never called, though voter education and registration were integral pieces of the training, but the voter education project was run by Southern Regional.
Yeah, the Southern.
Was it Southern Regional Council?
Yes.
Southern Regional Council,
I believe
in Atlanta.
Yes.
I think that's what they called their voter registration education effort. We called ours VEP. That's right. We called ours citizenship education. But we did more than just voter registration and training. Right. It really indeed was a citizenship education program. And in all that citizenship implies. But Andy came down with, because and the United Church of Christ had built, I think, several schools, but there was a school down at a little place called McIntosh, Georgia. It's about 30 miles south of Savannah. There was the Dorchester Academy developed by the church to teach freed slaves, I think, at the turn of the century. And but this building was just standing there and given to the community as kind of a community center. And Andy knew about the property, and Andy got that the church to give that over to the training program, because now SCLC has inherited the program from Highlander, and Andy's job was to help see that we expanded and kept that training program going. Teaching black folk how to be free is how we like to talk about it. So Andrew Young, Septima Clark, and I used to get in the cars, and we now have the grant coming again from the Marshall Field Foundation. And we would target certain areas around the South. They used to think Septima was the mother and Andy and I were the son and daughter. That's how we sort of looked driving around together. But we would go into communities and tell people about the training program. Into communities targeted because they had this civil rights activity. They had this protest activity going. Things were happening. At this time, we're not talking about 1961. I know because Andy came to SCLC in 1961. I came in 1960. I preceded Andy by a few months. Those are some dates I'm very clear about.
Registering people to vote during that time could be very dangerous work. Did you encounter any?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it would be important to note here that once we traveled around and recruited people to come take the training, sometimes we would bring a busload of folk from one community. And I remember, for example, the first time we met Fannie Lou Hamer, we had been recruiting and telling people in the Delta area of Mississippi about the training program, met Fannie Lou Hamer, and invited her to come to Dorchester Center now, in McIntosh, Georgia, and to bring other people with her. And she became a major recruiter for us in that area. There came a time when we no longer needed to go, but we ran a 5-day residential citizenship education training workshop every single month. And eventually we could just call key people and say, we tell Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, we tell the dates we have a 5-day workshop going, are there people you'd like to go through the training? And Fannie Lou Hamer was already working to register folk where she lived in Rouville, and lived on Mr. Marlowe's plantation, as she talked about. And Fannie Lou Hamer talked about being abused and threatened because of her work in voter registration education activities. She was told that she needed to get out of town, and her husband, Pap, as she called it, took her to the next county because they had been threatened. And she told us that she called Pap, and she called her husband and said, come get me, I'm not going to stay over here anymore, and I'm going to keep on doing my work. And she had become really politicized then, and she was ready to fight for the right to vote there in Mississippi. And so yes, people were certainly brutalized, but voter education registration became a key component of that training program.
SNCC would be organized in 1960, and I think both Dr. King as well as Ella Baker were intricately involved in that. Mm-hmm. Were you involved in
No, I didn't go to the planning meeting in which they held at Shaw University, as a matter of fact.
Right.
My old college, first college I went to. Ella Baker was really very key in setting the tone for organizing the SNCC folk. and really getting it going. They liked her style, and but she really took that on as her role to get SNCC going.
What eventually would you say the relationship, particularly in those early days when you're doing voter registration, SNCC is going to Mississippi, they're doing voter registration, Fannie Lou Hamer would eventually become part of SNCC, the Freedom Democratic Party. How did those organizations work, together? Were there a close association? Because, we read things. And
Yes.
there are all kinds of differences made.
Yes, well, in a real sense, there was a close association because we were doing the same work in a real sense. We might have had a little different style. For example, I don't know anyone else that had, for example, a training center where we would bring 40, 50, sometimes 60 people together at Dorchester Center, and they'd stay for 5 days in a residential workshop, learning how to become citizens and function and how to fight for their rights. People would leave Dorchester Center, the training workshops there and the citizenship education workshop. They would go back to their homes, and their towns were just never the same again. It was, we like to say, it really was the base upon so much of that training program, the base upon which really so much of the movement was built. Now, these people would leave Dorchester Center, go back into their communities, and there would be SNCC people very often living in these various communities, and their style was to indeed live in the communities and just, and be there and work that way. When we were running a training program, bringing people from all over the South, to that place. Now, when I hear of tension, between the various groups, ultimately, that really was true, but it was more like, I think Andy speaks of it this way, it's like children wanting to, sort of cut the umbilical cord and to be independent and alone and away from, the older people, because we were older than most of the SNCC people. It was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Here these people, there's Ella Vega, there's Martin Luther King, there's, Dorothy Cotton, there's Y.T. Walker, all older than the SNCC people. And I think it was just I saw it as, a gentle, kind of tension, but we were friends. We were in the same communities because we too, those of us working with the Citizenship Education Program, we were also in these communities. We didn't live in the communities on a long-term basis because wherever I would visit in a community, I also had to get back and plan the next 5-day training workshop. So we were all, it's like the NAACP working through the courts. Yes. We needed people working at all of those levels. And I think sometimes I run across people who make a bit too much out of the tension and dissension, though I also acknowledge that, yes, there came a time, and really to fast forward through the latter days of that phase of the civil rights movement, when, the Stokely Carmichael would say, enough of this nonviolent foolishness, take up the guns. And Stokely died talking about take up the gun. He spoke at Cornell University just a few months before he died, and I talked with him. And even then, speaking to those students at Cornell, last year, he was talking about, if take up the gun, take up the gun. He didn't say who he was going to shoot, but he said take up the gun.
Yes.
So there was, I think, a gentle kind of attention, and people, were getting tired after several years of struggling.
Yes.
Struggling, and it was only, of course, after Dr. King's death, I don't know if you saw the ABC television program, The Century, where they invited me to come down to Manhattan, and they wanted to talk about Dr. King's last week on Earth, and were very concerned about whether, what he was going through during those last days. Well, a part of what he was going through during those last days were challenges it was almost like, the sons challenging the father,
right.
But, that enough of this, Dr. King was very distressed by the now constant criticism. He had come out against the war in Vietnam, and he was very, and people were saying, if you, some of the, people saying things like, if you come into Washington, as we were planning the March on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign.
Right.
We will disrupt it, because the challenges were really heavy.
Yeah.
And that was very painful, but I'm just talking about the last days
But
there.
in those earlier days, there were several campaigns that normally stand out. Now we know about the sit-ins in '60, the Freedom Act in '61. '62, I believe, SCLC, Dr. King was invited to come to Albany, Georgia. And they went in, and some said that this was a defeat for the movement. Right after that, of course, evidently Fred Shuttlesworth had been involved, of course, and so we need to come to Birmingham. And you would be one of those that would come to Birmingham. What were those first days like, coming into Birmingham and trying to prepare people for what the vision of SCLC and the Alabama Christian Movement was, that particular era?
Just a comment about Albany. Many people have written and speak about Albany as a defeat for the movement. We don't think so. The reason we don't think so is that, if you think about movement, if you think about large numbers of people actually, in motion to bring about change, there's no blueprint for that. There's no pattern. You can't, you can look at Mahatma Gandhi and anybody that's conducted, major campaigns. There's no blueprint that tell you what's going to happen when you do, whatever you do. We learned a great lesson in Albany. And if we hadn't learned that lesson in Albany, we might have had to learn it here. But because we learned it in Albany, we didn't have to learn that one here. And we certainly had to learn, we were learning all the time. A major lesson was, to go in after things were so much in motion in a particular way that, if things are already in motion, it's kind of, and you don't do the basic fundamental groundwork of building your coalitions and that sort of thing. You're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna run into some really knotty places if you don't build the kind of coalitions on the ground. So we learned that we needed to do that to really build the coalitions, and I think that's just one of the lessons. But out of Albany, I think that we went in and too fast without doing that kind of coalition building. When we got to Birmingham, my sense is that the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights had been, Reverend Shuttlesworth had been on the firing lines a long time. But when SCLC was invited to come in here, I remember just massive numbers of meetings that were held with folk talking together about how we would come together, how SCLC would be helpful. And not that that was all that smooth either, but I think the coalitions were, I'm trying to think of the name of the group, the sort of citizens group that we were, Dr. King, Andy White, we were meeting with regularly here to solidify and make sure we did have the kind of dialogue going on.
Outside of the movement.
Yes, outside of the movement.
Right.
Local Birmingham people that would sit, and meet with, Martin and Ralph and Fred and me and Andy, and now we were meeting regularly with
Drew.
That's right, with a real coalition of people here in Birmingham. That was ongoing. Those meetings were regular and ongoing, and that was important. We could talk about, we know this long after the fact. We know that there was sort of, some jealousies, and now, and I know that there are people around who feel that they aren't getting the kind of credit that they should get. Some of the top leaders in the movement not feeling, some taking credit where no credit is due, and some just deciding, I'm gonna claim the credit that is due me, many years, after the fact. And movement is dynamic, it's not static.
Yes.
And so there were, a few hard places when folk didn't agree on what the strategy would be. I'm sure Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth can tell you, some of the sort of hard places where there was disagreement. I remember folk, some anger, among some of the people in the leadership cadre. But it didn't stop the movement.
Forward movement.
It didn't stop the forward movement. After all, these are human beings, working together to make something happen, to bring about basic change in the society.
One of the key issues of that time, of course, was the issue of the use of children. Can you speak to that?
People toss that phrase around where I travel around in certain places. Some academicians, for example, I was up in Minnesota not long ago, and someone said something about, they used a phrase, using children. I don't think of it that way, and I don't think anyone who was really thought about the movement in a real analytical or understanding way could think of that in a pejorative kind of negative way.
Right.
Because as I could begin to respond by quoting a young man, Mr. Hood, incidentally, who came here last summer when I brought a group of students here to the Institute, and just to hear stories of the Birmingham, from Birmingham people who were involved in the movement. And I asked the planners who set up a panel discussion to make sure you find some people who were teenagers, who were youngsters at the time. And Mr. Hood said, I'm blocking on his first name, which I should know, he said, I got involved as a teenager because I had to. I got involved because I would have felt and did feel so left out of what was happening until I got involved. I wish I had just taped his response. And I know that is what happened to a lot of young people who got involved. People were walking up and down the street saying things like, you going to the movement? You going to the meeting? It's like, you're just out of it. What do you mean you're not going? Everybody's going to the movement is how they said it. People, it was so dynamic and people were really caught up in it, and it didn't matter what was happening. Demonstrations, the big demonstrations, and the dogs and the fire hoses and all, that almost made more people want to come, sometimes out of curiosity, but once there for curiosity, people got caught up in the dynamics and actually the spirit of it, and also the justness of our cause, and understood and felt that something is happening here, and I'm going to miss out on something important if I don't get involved. Now, that being said, we also had, as a matter of fact, Andy asked me to come over here, me and James Bevel, to run some citizenship education workshops here in Birmingham. And I remember James Bevel and I sitting, working in the basement of the churches, and a handful of students coming by. And I was just explaining to them what all this dynamic activity is in Birmingham, and they were interested, what's going on, and to help them understand that we live in a democracy, but it is not perfect, and we have a major flaw, and we have to make it right. And so I remember a handful of students being in the church, and ultimately thousands of students being involved, because it just grew like topsy. Students got involved because they wanted to, and we knew, as I think it was Bevel who said once, you will get a greater education by being involved in this struggle than you will in any civics class.
Did you personally visit schools and enlist the aid of students? I know
think
Bevel did that.
We did it together. We did it together. Mm-hmm.
How did that work? What did you do?
Well, we would talk to students wherever we could. What I tried to do was to find some students who really understood, some who had been in the sessions at the churches, to find some students who really understood it, and to get them to help other students to see and to understand. I don't recall personally talking to an administrator at a school. The teachers, the school administrators were a little bit wary of, after all, they could get fired, right? So they had to be careful, but to be on the school grounds, which we were, and talking, we didn't get chased away. I think a lot of teachers and probably administrators, I'm speculating here, were very glad that the movement was happening and even supported students being involved in ultimately in massive numbers, but they couldn't say that out loud. There was a lot of quiet support, I think, amongst black educators, and I could mention among some whites that I know about who were supportive but would never ever say it out loud. The wonderful Mr. Emil Hess, for example, who I think founded and owned the Parisian department stores. He took me to lunch a few years ago, about a year or so before he passed. And I asked him that very question, what was it like for you, a very prominent businessman in Birmingham, what was it like for you during this time? And he actually said, if I had come out publicly supporting the movement, we wouldn't have had the Parisian stores and would have closed. Nobody would have come in the store if people had known. So he had to support, but he was supportive of our goals. And I'm not sure what else he did in terms of either financial or helping in negotiations, but he was supportive of the goals. But working with, it was exciting to see children get turned on to this notion that we have a democracy, and it is not right that a segment of the population should be excluded from the mainstream of life. Children came to understand that and understood it more than some of the parents did. And I think, as a matter of fact, I remember, I don't know the name, but I remember one father chasing his son because he had ordered his son not to be involved in this. There were a few folk, not every black person was pro-movement,
Yes,
right.
Right.
And not even all the preachers, though you hear them talk now, they all love Martin Luther King. But they didn't then, they didn't all love Martin Luther King, and they wished that he would get out of town with this mess, quote
He was
unquote.
an outside edges.
That's right. A few black folk felt that too. But I remember the son was running and the father was trying to catch him because he had ordered him not to get involved in this quote unquote mess. And I don't know whether he ever caught the son or not, but it's like Mr. Hood said, that son was probably involved because he too had to. He wasn't going to miss out. I'd like to know.
What was the meaning of Birmingham for the movement?
Oh, may I quote Mr. Emil Hess? I'm going to write about this in my book because he said it so well. This white man, big businessman in Birmingham, said Birmingham catapulted this country into the 21st century. And I think that is so true. Who in this country, maybe who in other countries, don't know about Birmingham, Alabama? And though it came to be called Birmingham, and we know why that was so, all the bombings that did, of course, occur here. But the world, first of all, the country saw this flaw in our democratic system through Birmingham. They saw the evil of segregation and racism through looking at Birmingham and what was going on here through the movement in Birmingham. It was like, cutting open a boil and letting out all the ugly stuff so healing can take place. That this is where that cutting open occurred so that all the ugliness could come out. The racial hatred and the ugliness of apartheid, American style. It could all be exorcised. Birmingham did that. We had probably worse, if not worse, at least just as violent response to demonstrations in St. Augustine, Florida, for example. But the country doesn't know about it. You never hear about St. Augustine. I remember marching in some of the big demonstrations in St. Augustine, the first place where we had night demonstration. And that's the place where I thought I could have got killed because I remember marching one night. I remember Andy Young was leading the march, and I wasn't far behind, and someone threw a brick across and went right, 2 or 3 more inches. It would have hit my head, but it went between me and the person walking in front of me and shattered a store window when they threw the brick. And I remember somebody jumping on Andy's back and having him on the ground. And even today, I shudder to think the guy could have had a knife or something. But Andy was leading the march. But we had been so we'd run workshops and we were so disciplined. And but there were no cameras. That didn't get out around the country. But cameras showed all the ugliness of this terrible flaw in our system. Cameras showed it from Birmingham.
That's right. And Birmingham then is pictured all over the world.
All over the world.
And that is what created the dynamic
Yes.
that would eventually change Birmingham.
Yes.
And probably change the world.
And change, absolutely.
Now, I know that you also traveled with Dr. King internationally. Was it was rather early that he made a trip to, was it to Ghana? Did he go to Ghana?
I didn't go, I never went to Africa with him. I went to, actually, I don't know if people know, Dr. King loved to go to Jamaica to write. When he was gonna take a, little sabbatical from the activity and write, he loved to go. I remember once he went to Bimini 2 or 3 times. That was Adam Clayton, the former Congressman Adam Clayton Powell's hang out there, a little cottage there. And I remember, and places in Jamaica where he would write. And Andy and Bernard Lee and I have on occasion, we would go down and he would sit and write and sometimes people would even loan him a house and that was staffed, and he would sit and write, and we would over lunch read what he'd written as he was writing some of his books, go over the chapter that he'd written, say during the morning. I got to go with him to Europe, to Oslo, Norway, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and there were about 30 of us in that entourage, and we went in 2 separate planes, about 15 on each plane, but I did get to go to Europe with him for the Nobel Peace Prize trip.
Let me ask you about there was a certain amount of tension in the movement early, because I think it was Stokely and people that were in SNCC who opposed the war earlier than Martin Luther King at CLC. The day, though, that he made his announcement that he was in opposition to the war, were you at Ebenezer that morning? Or do you remember the dynamics that were taking place during that time in him? Because it really appears that he was agonizing over,
whether he would come out against the war,
Yes.
the Vietnam War.
Right.
He made a major speech in New York at I think it was at the Riverside Church.
Riverside.
The major speech. I was there when he made the major speech. That's the time that it got great publicity, as I recall. When he made, I think there were either more cameras around or something.
Yeah, yes.
In
There
New York.
was, and he did the same thing.
Speak in Atlanta. I'm sure I was there. That's kind of, I don't know why I'm remembering the New York one.
Right.
And because I was, I'm pretty much everywhere he was. I'm sure in Atlanta, I'm sure I was around, but.
Those days coming up to that, were there discussions among you about that?
Oh, yes. There were, I was a part of some of the actual arguments among the staff. He did agonize over whether he should make that, not just among the staff, but also board members.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, one of the most painful experiences that Dr. King had around that, coming out against the war, was the circulation of a letter signed by, supposedly by the board, telling him not to speak out against the war, that was not our place. And this is, in-house criticism or advice not to speak out against the war. And I love this line. He said, at some point when he was getting criticism from everywhere, that well, we know that quite a line that's quoted a lot, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And he said that in relationship to that war. And he had been studying what the Vietnamese people had gone through for, so many decades, being oppressed by, one nation
Right.
after the other. And he was so committed to the evil of that war. And, but also when that letter was circulated, supposedly coming from the board, but we know really I guess the real source of the letter that got circulated. It was really painful because it was signed by someone who was actually kind of a family friend, Marion Logan, who was on the board. She was also a family friend. And I have a feeling that she's sad that she signed the letter for the board.
Right.
But to get that, from a friend, but Dr. King said, if I am the last lone voice speaking out, against his board, that I will do. He didn't back down a bit, but it was painful to hear,
Yes.
to have criticism coming from such close close quarters in house. Yes.
That, of course, there were criticism that suggested that what did Dr. King know about international affairs? He was a Southern Baptist minister. And of course, he, in fact, would answer that with the whole question of an injustice any place.
Is injustice everywhere, yeah. Yes, he said that on more than one occasion, and made the same point. Dr. King made the same point in relation to criticism of his being in Birmingham.
Right,
After the group of ministers wrote the letter, and of course, Dr. King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail, I think gives such a wonderful analysis and response to criticism of being working in a place other than where he lived.
Some suggest that Dr. King became more threatened after he had made the speech against the war, and then he started to talk about the necessity of poor people, blacks and whites, Appalachian whites, coming together to develop the movement.
Mm-hmm.
That created some difficulty for some folk and the threats escalated.
The threats escalated on the heels of the anti-Vietnam War coming out statement. Threats on his life did indeed escalate. Threats escalated, and this is happening kind of during the same time frame. Threats escalated after the announcement of the Poor People's Campaign that is bringing now all poor people together. And one of the stories I'm telling in my book about that is a white Appalachian preacher who called the SCLC offices one day and said, my name is Preacher Red, he said. And he said, and I want to talk to somebody that's high up in SCLC. And interestingly, I said, well, let me see if I can find somebody high up. And I went to talk to Andy. I don't know if Andy will remember this, but Andy said, I said, here's somebody on the phone who wants to talk to somebody high up. And he said, his name's Preacher Red. And Andy said, well, ask him if you're high up enough. But of course, see, the women's movement hadn't happened then.
Right,
otherwise,
right.
I would have said, well, I'm high up. But today, I would simply take the call. But I did meet with this white preacher from Appalachia. We went to Pascal's Motel. So it must have been well, that was the black, motel, and it was a place where we could go eat, and black and white could eat together.
Now, this was a preacher from Appalachia?
Yes, and what he said was, I just want you to know that I have hated Dr. King. I hate Dr. King. He put it in the present tense, and I said, well, what do you mean? Why? But he wasn't threatening to me. He said, because he's leaving us out. And that was just very moving, even as I think about it now. We have the same needs, he said, and as Dr. King, the same need for the kind of leadership and that Dr. King is giving to you all, your people, and we're left out. You know, poor fella, he didn't know where to go or what to do, but he saw something going on. And you could tell he was afraid. I mean, it was a sort of, furtive, attitude. It was almost like he was nervous.
Is this when Dr. King then expanded?
Well, we hired, I'm blocking on the young man's name, a white fellow on our staff to begin organizing. We started recruiting in Appalachia. We hired a white fellow to go into Appalachia to recruit people to come to the citizenship training workshops because they had to get the background. They had to understand nonviolence. They had to understand why fighting for the right to vote was so much a part of of the dynamic, of the movement. It wasn't just about having a demonstration, and I always sort of get my dander up when people talk about the movement as a lot of demonstrations, because it was so much more than, big demonstrations, but folks see the marches on television and they think that was all that the movement was about. They don't know, the planning and the basic goal was to really rearrange the social order in this country and to, as Dr. Vincent Harding at the Olive School of Theology puts it, to advance democracy in this country is what that movement was about. It was, so it was just, so much more. So the people, they had to come through training, and I have just burst into tears when I think about the first time a group of white folk came from Appalachia now, after all these years, to Dorchester Center, to a citizenship education workshop.
By this time, Dr. King was bigger than life.
Yes.
He was the focus. Of course, his assassination, all kinds of questions that were raised. Did the movement die with Dr. King in 1968?
The movement did not die with Dr. King. I couldn't possibly use that phrase, and I know some people do see it that way, but I think that I so see that movement, and let me say that phase of the struggle to advance democracy, I see it as a period and as a phase of our struggle for democracy. And I see it as a phase that couldn't possibly continue. There is no way we could have kept the momentum the way it was at that time. I think it was neither physically nor emotionally possible to move at that pace and to continue. At the same time, I think even if Dr. King had lived, I think it would have taken, it was evolving. It would have had to take, a different turn. Even Dr. King was seeing this, and I haven't said this very broadly, but he was even thinking that maybe I should take a sabbatical. And he talked about that. He talked about that to me, and I don't know who else he said that to, but he was pondering, really, where do we go from here? And thinking that that it was, maybe he needed to pull away. Dr. King was very clear and said this, there were riots happening in some places. Now, and again, people sometimes speak of riots that occurred in Watts or wherever, and then they called Dr. King to come, put out the fire, as it were, and he had to say on more than one occasion, I'm not a fireman. And that's not how we work. That's not what the movement is about. It was getting people in motion and using the nonviolent perspective to organize people and to move us forward. So my sense is that, well, to give a quick example, when ultimately Andy Young decided to run for Congress, to me that was a part of the movement. Isn't that, you can't just demonstrate all the rest of your life, And people also get older, but it's evolving. It's so you go on to other phases, and I think if Dr. King had lived, that probably would, at some point been some structure that helped us really move into a way of looking at the economics, which is what Dr. King was, that's what the Poor People's Campaign was about. Let's look at the economic underpinning of this apartheid system that has been so oppressive to Black people and poor people in general. And so it was evolving, and who knows, we might have started pulling in economists, and maybe, we don't know, but I know that it couldn't have stayed the same, like it didn't stay the same from the early days of the sit-in movement to 1968. The sit-in movement, when those students sat in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1960.
Right.
And, but things happened after, all the protest activity in all of these places. Things changed and we became clearer and clearer on where we needed to go in the movement.
You've been very gracious with your time, and I certainly appreciate it. I don't want to wear you out today. We could talk for another 3 hours, I'm sure. But I really appreciate you taking your time out and coming to sit with us. So the next time you're in town, we would have to continue here.
Yes, and we'll talk about what I'm doing now in terms
Absolutely.
of setting up and coordinating, convening what we're calling the National Citizenship School to look at what citizenship, what civic functioning means for the 21st century. No longer do we have to help black folk and poor folk en masse understand that we can all not be victims, but be a part of this wonderful democracy that we have with its flaws and work on what we need to work on for now.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Ms. Cotton, for being